Rain battered the hospital windows in relentless sheets, each drop striking like a fist against the glass. Inside the delivery room, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their sterile glow over white walls and cold metal. Claire Mendoza gripped the rails of the bed, knuckles whitening, her breaths coming in shallow gasps between the waves of pain. Sweat trickled down her temples, dampening strands of hair that clung to her face. The air was thick with the sterile scent of antiseptic and the quiet murmur of nurses who exchanged glances when they thought she couldn't hear. "Where's the father?" one whispered near the door. "Not here," another answered softly, though the pity in her tone was louder than the words. Claire's eyes closed briefly, but not from exhaustion. It was shame, humiliation. She had spent 27 years building the kind of resilience that only comes from being disappointed too many times. But tonight that strength felt like it was slipping through her fingers. Nathan had been a different man once. Charming, ambitious, the type who could talk his way into a boardroom or out of a parking ticket with the same easy smile. But over the last year, that charm had soured into something sharp and unpredictable. Late nights became unexplained absences, conversations became arguments, love became silence. And now, as her body clenched with another contraction, he was still nowhere in sight. She tried to focus on the rhythm of her breathing, the encouraging murmurs of the nurse at her side, the faint beeping of the monitor tracking 2 heartbeats, hers and the tiny one she was about to meet. The door swung open, and for one heartbeat, she let herself hope. Nathan stepped inside, his sandy hair damp from the storm, his suit rumpled, but there were no flowers in his hands, no look of worry or relief on his face. Instead, he held a manila envelope, the corners bent from being gripped too tightly. "You have got to be kidding me," Claire whispered, her voice thin from both pain and disbelief. He didn't bother answering her question. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his tone flat, almost rehearsed. Look at you, Claire. You're a mess. This isn't the life I signed up for." A contraction tore through her, forcing her to clutch the rails again, but his words cut deeper than the pain in her body. "You're unattractive now," he continued, each syllable like a blow. "You've become a burden. I'm not going to waste the rest of my life chained to someone who looks like you." He set the envelope on the rolling table beside her bed with a sharp tap. "Divorce papers. Sign them when you can. I'll have my lawyer handle the rest." "Nathan." But he was already moving toward the door, his hand on the handle before she could find the words to beg him to stay, to tell him that this was their child, their moment. The door closed behind him with a hollow click. The storm outside howled in his absence. Minutes later, through tears she could barely see through, she bore down with every ounce of strength left in her. 23 agonizing minutes after Nathan's departure, a cry split the air, high and strong, piercing through the grief and the humiliation like sunlight through storm clouds. They placed the baby on her chest, warm and impossibly small. Claire wrapped her arms around her daughter, holding her close, letting the fragile rhythm of that tiny heartbeat anchor her to something pure and unbroken. She pressed her lips to the baby's damp hair and whispered into the crown of her head, "You will never feel alone. Not while I'm breathing." Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, Claire Mendoza made a vow that would carry her through every hardship to come. Her daughter would never, not for a single moment, doubt she was wanted. 2 years had passed since that stormy night, and Claire Mendoza's life had been reduced to a careful balancing act on the edge of survival. The city was waking slowly outside her apartment window, but Claire had already been awake for hours. The kitchen smelled faintly of instant coffee and toast, but she was too tired to taste anything. She stood at the counter with her uniform shirt half tucked in, her hair pulled into a loose knot, packing a lunch into a worn plastic container for her daughter Ava. The apartment was small enough that every sound carried. Ava's laughter drifted from the bedroom as she hummed some song she had learned at preschool. That sound was what kept Claire moving most mornings. It was what had kept her moving every day since the night Nathan walked out. She had no family nearby, no friends she could lean on, and no safety net except for the love she gave and received from her child. Claire worked 2 jobs just to stay afloat. By day, she waited tables at a noisy diner where tips could make or break her ability to buy groceries. By night, she cleaned offices long after everyone else had gone home. The work left her bones aching and her eyes stinging, but she pushed through because Ava needed her to. That morning, as she zipped Ava's backpack, she noticed the slip of paper taped to the inside of the door. Her breath caught. It was an eviction notice printed in cold block letters. She read it twice, her stomach turning to ice. She had 14 days to pay the balance or leave. She hid the paper quickly before Ava could see it and forced her voice into something light. "Hurry up, baby, we can't be late today." Ava appeared in the doorway wearing her little pink coat and the mismatched mittens she loved. She wrapped her small arms around Claire's waist. "Mama, do you think Daddy knows it's my birthday next week?" The question landed like a knife. Claire knelt, down smoothing Ava's hair. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I know I'll be there, and that's what matters." At the diner that afternoon, the tables were crowded with the lunch rush and the air was thick with the smell of grilled onions and coffee. Claire's feet ached as she carried trays back and forth, but she kept her smile in place. She had learned that customers noticed your mood, and a good mood meant better tips. It was while she was clearing a corner booth that she noticed a man watching her from across the room. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, his dark eyes sharp but not unkind. When she looked back, he didn't glance away. Instead, he offered the smallest nod as though he already knew her. Something about the way he held her gaze made her uneasy, but also curious. She didn't know it yet, but this stranger was going to change everything, and he would do it in ways she could never have imagined. The next morning began like any other, with the stale smell of last night's coffee still hanging in the kitchen and the sound of Ava's small feet padding across the worn linoleum. Claire tied her hair back and checked the clock. She had an early shift at the diner, followed by a meeting with the landlord that she already knew would end badly. Money was tighter than ever, and the eviction notice felt like a ticking clock in her head. She tried to push the worry down as she walked to work, but it clung to her like the winter cold. The streets were wet from an overnight rain, and the wind bit at her cheeks. By the time she reached the diner, she had her apron on and her practiced smile ready. She was halfway through her shift when the bell above the door jingled, and he walked in. The same man from yesterday, the one who had watched her with that steady, unreadable gaze, now stepped into the diner as if he had been here 1,000 times. He took a seat at the same corner booth and set his phone face down on the table, like he had nowhere else to be. Claire tried to ignore him, but his presence was impossible to miss. Something about him was different from the usual customers. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who never had to hurry, never had to wonder how the bills would be paid. When she approached his table, he smiled slightly. "You're busier than yesterday." His voice was low, calm, but it carried a weight that made her pause. She poured his coffee without answering and focused on the task, hoping he would take the hint. Instead, he watched her as though studying every small movement. After a moment, he said, "I was hoping to see you again." Claire stiffened. "How do you know my name?" "It's on your name tag," he said with a hint of amusement. "But that's not the only reason. I read people for a living, and I can see you're carrying more than you should have to." She didn't like it. How close he was to the truth. It made her feel exposed. "You don't know anything about me," she said quietly. "Maybe not yet," he replied. "But I know someone who works this hard for this little isn't just doing it for themselves." Before she could respond, a shadow fell across the booth. Claire turned, and her breath caught. Nathan stood there, his smirk exactly as she remembered it, and his eyes scanning the man in the booth before settling on her. "Didn't expect to find you here," he said. The stranger's expression didn't change, but his gaze sharpened. Claire's pulse pounded as the air between them thickened with something dangerous. In that moment, she realized the two men were measuring each other in a silent exchange she didn't understand. And whatever it meant, she knew her life was about to shift in a way she couldn't control. The diner had gone strangely quiet, the clatter of dishes and hum of conversation fading under the weight of the moment. Claire stood frozen between the booth and the counter, her hands gripping the coffee pot so tightly she thought it might crack. Nathan leaned against the edge of the table like he owned the place, his smirk curling in that familiar way that once made her stomach twist. But now there was something different in his eyes, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. The man in the booth looked up at Nathan with calm, steady eyes, the kind that didn't flinch or break away. He set his cup down with deliberate slowness before speaking. "You must be Nathan," he said, as though the name had already been whispered to him somewhere else. "I've heard nothing about you." Nathan's smirk faltered for a moment before he recovered. "And you are someone who doesn't appreciate the way you're standing over her." The man replied, his voice even but edged with authority. Claire's breath caught at the way he said it, like he wasn't asking for Nathan to move, he was commanding it. Nathan's laugh was low and bitter. "What are you, her new boss? Her latest project?" She didn't answer, choosing instead to pour coffee for another table just to put space between them. She could feel both men watching her, their gazes heavy in different ways. Nathan's was laced with ownership, like she was something he could pick up again whenever he pleased. The stranger's was protective and unreadable, as if he was trying to decide whether to get involved. When she returned to the booth, Nathan was gone, but not before muttering something under his breath that made her skin crawl. The man in the booth handed her a folded piece of paper. "My name is Adrian Cole. If he comes back or bothers you again, call this number, day or night." She looked down at the card. Heavy paper with gold-embossed letters that felt out of place in her calloused hand. She almost laughed. "Why would I need you to save me?" she asked quietly. His gaze held hers, and for a moment she saw something fierce flicker there. "Because you don't see it yet, but you're already mine," he said simply. Then slid out of the booth, leaving a generous tip under his coffee cup. The door closed behind him and the bell above it jingled lightly, as if nothing had happened, but Claire's heart was pounding. She tucked the card into her apron, unsure if she'd ever use it, but unable to throw it away. Outside, the rain had started again, a thin, steady drizzle that blurred the view through the window. She watched Adrian step into a sleek black car, the kind she had only seen in movies. The engine purred, and the car disappeared into the street, leaving her with the unsettling feeling that her world had just tilted in a direction she couldn't name yet, but could feel deep in her bones. 2 nights later, the sound of Ava's coughing tore through the small apartment, waking Claire from a restless sleep. She rushed to her daughter's side, finding her cheeks flushed and her little body trembling under the thin blanket. Panic gripped her as she pressed a hand to Ava's forehead. She was burning up. The city was still wrapped in darkness when Claire bundled Ava into her coat and carried her down the creaking stairs into the cold night air. The wind cut through her thin sweater as she hurried to the bus stop, praying the first morning bus would come quickly. Every minute, Ava's breathing seemed to grow more labored. By the time they reached the emergency room, the waiting area was nearly empty. Claire filled out the forms with shaking hands, but her stomach knotted when the receptionist quietly told her that her insurance wouldn't cover the full cost of treatment. She swallowed hard. "I'll find a way," she said, though she had no idea how. A nurse led Ava to an examination room and Claire followed close behind, never letting go of her hand. She sat by the bed watching the IV drip into her daughter's arm, each drop falling like a clock counting down. The doctor's words blurred together, but she caught enough to know Ava needed more tests, and they wouldn't be cheap. Claire stepped into the hallway to make a call to her boss, hoping for an advance on her paycheck, but before she could dial, she froze. A deep, familiar voice spoke her name. "Claire." She turned, and there he was. Adrian Cole, standing in the stark hospital corridor dressed in a dark coat, his presence somehow even more commanding under the harsh fluorescent lights. "How did you know I was here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I called the diner to find you," he said, "and when they told me you hadn't come in, I started looking." His eyes moved past her to the room where Ava lay. "Is she going to be all right, Claire?" He hesitated, then nodded. "She will be if I can pay for it," she admitted, and the words tasted bitter in her mouth. Without a word, Adrian reached into his coat and pulled out a sleek black wallet. He stepped past her to the nurse's station and spoke quietly to the staff. Moments later, the nurse returned with a reassuring smile. "Everything's covered," she said. Claire felt a rush of relief so strong it nearly made her dizzy, but with it came suspicion. Why would you do that? She asked when they were alone again. Adrian looked at her for a long moment before answering. Because no child should have to wait for help, and no mother should have to beg for it. That night he stayed in the chair by Ava's bed, telling her silly stories until she finally drifted off to sleep. Claire watched them in silence, torn between gratitude and a creeping fear. She had learned that nothing came without a price, but Adrian's eyes held no hint of expectation, only a quiet promise she didn't understand yet. And for the first time in years, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, this man meant exactly what he said. The weeks that followed felt strange to Claire, like her life had shifted into a rhythm she didn't recognize. Adrian didn't vanish after paying Ava's hospital bill. Instead, he began appearing in small, unexpected ways. A text to check if Ava was feeling better, a bag of groceries left outside her door with no note, an envelope with just enough money to cover the rent tucked into her mailbox. At first, Claire resisted every gesture, certain there had to be a catch. But Adrian's help never came with strings. He didn't ask for dinners or favors. Sometimes he would just invite her and Ava to the park, where he'd push Ava on the swings until she was breathless with laughter. Other days they would visit the library, where he'd sit cross-legged on the floor, reading to her as if he'd been doing it all his life. It was during one of those afternoons at the park that Adrian finally shared something about himself. He told Claire how he had grown up bouncing between foster homes, never knowing if he'd still be in the same bed the next week. How the first thing he ever owned that no one could take away was a second-hand suit he bought at 16 for a job interview. How every deal he made and every dollar he earned since was to make sure he never felt powerless again. Hearing that cracked something in her. She recognized the same quiet fight in him that she had lived with every day since Nathan left. She found herself wanting to know more about him, but before she could ask, he glanced over her shoulder and his expression hardened. A black sedan sat idling across the street. The windows were tinted, but Claire felt the weight of someone's stare even from that distance. The car stayed parked for several minutes before slowly pulling away. She told herself it was nothing, but Adrian didn't look convinced. That evening, as she walked home with Ava bundled against the wind, she spotted the same car, parked half a block from her building. This time, she saw the driver. Nathan. His smirk was unmistakable, even through the glass. He didn't wave, didn't get out, just watched her until she disappeared inside. Her stomach churned. She hadn't seen him since the day in the diner, and she had no idea why he was back now. That night, she double-checked the locks and lay awake listening to the creaks of the building, wondering if he was still out there. The next morning, Adrian showed up at her door without calling. His jaw was tight, his tone clipped. "I need to know if you've been followed before today." She shook her head, but he didn't seem satisfied. "Stay close to me for a while," he said. He didn't explain why, but the way his eyes moved to the street below made her pulse quicken. Somewhere deep inside, Claire knew this wasn't just a coincidence. Nathan's return wasn't random, and whatever he wanted this time, it wasn't going to be simple. 3 days later, the knock at her door came just after sunset, sharp and deliberate. Claire froze halfway through washing the dinner dishes, her hands still wet. Ava was on the floor in the living room, drawing with crayons, humming to herself. Claire dried her hands quickly and opened the door only a crack. Nathan stood there leaning against the frame as if he had all the time in the world. His eyes swept over her apartment and the faint smirk tugged at his mouth. "Nice place for now," he said. Claire's grip tightened on the door. "What do you want, Nathan?" He stepped forward until the chain lock caught between them. "I want what's mine," he said softly, and for a moment she thought he meant her. But then he added, "And I want my daughter." Claire's chest tightened. "You haven't cared about her in 2 years." Nathan's smirk didn't fade. "I care now because I know you've been spending time with Adrian Cole. You think I don't know who he is, what he's worth. I'm willing to make a deal, Claire. Let me back in and we can be a family again. Or fight me and I'll take Ava through the courts." Her heart pounded so loudly she barely heard the sound of footsteps behind her until Adrian appeared. He didn't knock. He didn't call first. He just walked in like the space already belonged to him. Nathan's smile faltered when he saw him. Adrian didn't raise his voice, but his words cut clean. "You had 2 years to show up and you didn't. You abandoned them. And now you're here because you see a price tag." Nathan chuckled low and mean. And what are you going to do about it, Cole? Buy me off? Adrian stepped closer, his gaze never breaking. No, I'm going to bury you legally so deep you'll forget what daylight looks like. Then he reached forward and calmly closed the door in Nathan's face, the chain lock still holding. Claire's knees felt weak, but Adrian caught her by the arm, steadying her. He's not going to stop. P, she whispered. Adrian's expression was cold and certain. Then we make sure he can't start again. That night, Adrian called someone from his car, speaking in clipped tones she couldn't quite hear. When he returned, his voice softened, but the steel underneath remained. From now on, you don't go anywhere alone. You and Ava stay with me. Claire wanted to argue to say she didn't need saving, but the truth was Nathan's threat had sunk into her bones. As Adrian helped her pack the essentials, she glanced once at the darkened street below, half expecting to see the black sedan again. She didn't know yet what Nathan's next move would be, but she knew this wasn't over. And in that moment, she realized the fight for her daughter had just begun. Adrian's penthouse was nothing like the world Claire knew. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering skyline, the city lights stretching out like a field of stars. The air smelled faintly of cedar and something expensive she couldn't name. Ava ran from room to room in wide-eyed wonder, her laughter echoing off the marble floors while Claire stood awkwardly by the doorway, clutching the small bag of clothes she'd managed to pack. Adrian took the bag from her, setting it down on a sleek leather chair. You'll be safe here, he said, but his tone carried more than reassurance. It carried a promise. Still, Claire couldn't shake the unease that followed her from the apartment. She could almost feel Nathan's presence like a shadow clinging to her heels. That night, after Ava had fallen asleep in the guest room, Adrian called Claire to the living area. A man in a gray suit was waiting there, a laptop open on the coffee table. This is Daniel, my head of security, Adrian said. He's going to explain what we're dealing with. Daniel's voice was calm, but each word landed heavy. Nathan has debts, serious ones. He owes money to people who won't wait much longer. When they realized you were connected to Adrian, they saw a way to leverage him through you. Nathan's sudden interest in custody isn't about Ava. It's about using her to get what he wants. Claire felt her stomach twist. So this isn't just about him wanting to hurt me. Daniel shook his head. It's about money and control. Adrian leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. Which means we need to be ahead of him. We've started digging into his finances and contacts. Once we have enough, we'll shut him down completely. The words should have comforted her, but instead they made her pulse quicken. Nathan had always been unpredictable when cornered. She thought of the black sedan parked outside her apartment and the way he had smiled as if he already it. Di knew her next move. 2 nights later, her fears proved right. Claire was in the kitchen making tea when the security system chimed softly. A movement alert. Daniel checked the cameras and his jaw tightened. Nathan was downstairs in the lobby arguing with the building's security. He had a man with him, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of stillness that felt dangerous. Before Claire could panic, Adrian was already pulling on his coat. Stay here with Daniel. He ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. She watched him on the live feed stride into the lobby, his presence alone enough to make Nathan's companion shift uneasily. The camera didn't catch their words, but it caught Nathan's face twisting in frustration as Adrian leaned in close, speaking low enough that only he could hear. Seconds later, Nathan turned on his heel, the other man following him out into the night. When Adrian returned, his jaw was set and his eyes darker than she had ever seen them. He didn't tell her what he had said to Nathan, only that things were about to escalate. And as she lay awake that night listening to the quiet hum of the city below, Claire knew he was right. The real storm hadn't even begun. The storm arrived sooner than Claire expected, not in the form of rain or wind, but in a single phone call that shattered the brief calm she had begun to feel. It was mid-morning. Ava was in the playroom, and Claire was sitting by the window sipping coffee when Adrian's phone rang. His expression changed the moment he answered, the muscles in his jaw tightening as he listened. When he hung up, he didn't speak for a long moment, just stared out at the skyline as if calculating every possible outcome. Nathan filed for emergency custody. He finally said, his voice low. The hearing is in 3 days. Claire's heart slammed in her chest. Emergency custody. How is that even possible? Adrian's eyes met hers, steady but edged with something she hadn't seen before, a kind of controlled fury. He's claiming you're unstable, that you move too often, that you can't provide a safe environment for Ava. Her hands trembled around the coffee cup. That's not true. He knows it's not true. Adrian stepped closer, taking the cup from her before it slipped. That's not the point. He's not trying to win the case. He's trying to scare you into giving him what he wants. Daniel entered the room holding a folder. We've been tracking Nathan's movements. 2 days ago, he met with someone connected to a man named Victor Dre, a loan shark who doesn't take no for an answer. This isn't just about custody. It's leverage. Claire felt the walls of the penthouse closing in. All she could think of was Ava, her small body curled up asleep, unaware of the battle building around her. What if the court believes him? She whispered. Adrian's voice was quiet but unwavering. They won't. Not if we play this right. The next hours were a blur of strategy meetings with Adrian's legal team. They gathered every piece of evidence they could, medical records showing Nathan's absence at Ava's birth, text messages that proved years of neglect, witnesses' statements from neighbors and teachers. Claire sat through it all feeling like she was preparing for war. That night she couldn't sleep. She wandered into the living room and found Adrian on the balcony, phone pressed to his ear. His tone was sharp, clipped with authority she rarely heard from him. When he ended the call, he turned to her, and for the first time she saw how much this fight mattered to him, not just for her, but for Ava. He knelt in front of her, his hands warm around hers. No matter what happens in that courtroom, you and Ava are mine now. No one takes you from me. The next morning, a new threat arrived. A single envelope slid under the penthouse door. Inside was a photograph of Claire and Ava at the park, taken just days ago. No note, no signature, just the picture. Adrian stared at it for a long moment, then looked at Daniel. Find out who took this. Now. Claire realized then that the custody battle was only part of the danger. Someone was watching them, someone who wasn't Nathan. And whoever it was had just stepped into the game. The day of the custody hearing dawned gray and heavy, as if the city itself knew a reckoning was coming. Claire stood in front of the mirror in a simple navy dress, her hands trembling as she smoothed the fabric. Ava was still asleep in the guest room, guarded by one of Adrian's security team. Adrian entered quietly, already dressed in a tailored suit, his expression unreadable, but his eyes never leaving hers. We walk in together, he said, and we walk out together, no matter what happens. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. Reporters waited on the steps, their cameras clicking, but Adrian's presence kept them at a distance. Inside the courtroom, Nathan sat at the petitioner's table wearing a suit that didn't quite fit his shoulders, his smirk firmly in place. He didn't look at Claire, instead, leaning toward his lawyer and whispering something that made the man's lips curl into a smile. The proceedings began, and Nathan's lawyer painted a picture of Claire as unstable, financially incapable, and reckless. Each word felt like a slap, but Claire kept her chin high, her hands folded in her lap. When it was their turn, Adrian's lawyer dismantled every accusation with precision. Witnesses testified about Nathan's absence and neglect. Documents proved his debts and ties to dangerous people. Then Adrian stood taking the witness stand himself. He spoke with quiet authority about the night in the diner, the hospital bills, the threats, and the surveillance. He didn't embellish, didn't raise his voice, but each sentence was a hammer striking at Nathan's credibility. When he finished, the room was silent except for the judge's pen scratching against paper. The judge recessed for an hour to review the evidence. Claire stepped into the hallway, her legs shaking. Adrian stood close, his hand at the small of her back, anchoring her. She wanted to believe they had won, but the image of that photograph from the park lingered in her mind. Someone else was still out there watching. When the judge returned, the decision was swift. Full custody awarded to Claire. Nathan's visitation rights suspended indefinitely pending further investigation into his financial dealings. The gavel struck and it was over. Nathan's smirk vanished, replaced by a look she had never seen on him before. Fear. As they left the courthouse, a man in a dark coat stepped out from the crowd. He moved with deliberate calm, his gaze fixed on Adrian. He handed him a small, sealed envelope and walked away without a word. Adrian opened it there on the courthouse steps. Inside was a single sentence typed on a strip of paper. Nathan was never your only problem. Claire felt the blood drain from her face. Adrian's jaw tightened as he slid the paper into his pocket. Get Ava, he told Daniel, his tone leaving no room for delay. As they walked toward the waiting car, Claire realized the victory in court was just one battle. The real war, the one with an enemy she couldn't yet see, was only beginning.